Hellhounds, chase ghosts, come sleep, watch out, demons are coming, run, sleep, hide, spirits, ghosts, hide, demons, hellhounds, ghosts, demons are coming.
Welcome home, my little hellhounds. Tonight we have something very different. We have a true crime episode of one of the most famous serial killers in the world, Ted Bundy. So don't forget to click that like button and subscribe, and click that bell icon so you get notified every time I upload. Now, let's get right into it. Theodore Robert Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell in November 24th, 1946, and died January 24th, 1989. He was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s. And possibly even earlier. After more than a decade of denials, he confessed to 30 homicides committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. His true victim total is currently unknown and believed by some investigators to be higher. Bundy was regarded as handsome and charismatic, traits that he exploited to win the trust of his victims and society. He would typically approach his victims in public places, feigning injury or disability, or impersonating an authority figure, before knocking them unconscious and taking them to secluded locations to rape and strangle them. He sometimes revisited his victims, grooming and performing sexual acts with the decomposing corpses until putrefaction and destruction by wild animals made any further interactions impossible. He decapitated at least 12 victims and kept some of the severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, he broke into people's homes at night and bludgeoned his victims as they slept. In 1975, Bundy was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, he engineered 2 dramatic escapes and committed further assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, before his ultimate recapture in 1978. For the Florida homicides, he received 3 death sentences in 2 trials. Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, on January 24th, 1989. Biographer Anne Rule described Bundy as sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. He once described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. Attorney Polly Nelson, a member of his last defense team, called him the very definition of heartless evil. Ted Bundy's childhood. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell, who was born 1924, died in 2012, known as Louise, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His father's identity has never been confirmed. By some accounts, his birth certificate assigns paternity to a salesman and Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, though according to others, the father is listed as unknown. Louise claimed she had been seduced by a war veteran named Jack Worthington, and the Kings County Sheriff's Office has him listed as the father in their files. Some family members expressed suspicions that Bundy might have been fathered by Louise's own violent, abusive father, Samuel Cowell, but no material evidence has ever been cited to support this. For the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Philadelphia home of his maternal grandparents. Samuel, born 1898, died 1983, and Eleanor Cowell, born 1895, died in 1971, who raised him as their own son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied birth outside of wedlock. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. He eventually discovered the truth, although his recollections of the circumstances varied. He told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard, but he told biographers Stephen McCord and Hugh Ainsworth that he found the certificate himself. Biographer and true crime writer Anne Rule, who knew Bundy personally, believed that he did not find out until 1969, when he located his original birth record in Vermont. Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment towards his mother for never talking to him about his real father and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. In some interviews, Bundy spoke warmly of his grandparents and told Rule that he identified with and respected and clung to his grandfather. In 1987, however, he and other family members told attorneys that Samuel Cowell was a tyrannical bully and a bigot who hated blacks, Italians, Catholics and Jews, beat his wife and the family dog, and swung neighbourhood cats by the tails. He once threw Louise's younger sister, Julia, down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. He sometimes spoke aloud to unseen presences, and at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. Bundy described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression and feared to leave their house toward the end of her life. Bundy occasionally exhibited disturbing behaviour at an early age. Julia recalled waking up from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen and Bundy standing by the bed, smiling. In 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson, and at the urging of multiple family members, she left Philadelphia with her son to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, born 1921, died in 2007, a hospital cook at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. They married later that year, and Johnny Bundy formally adopted Ted. Johnny and Louise conceived 4 children of their own, and although Johnny tried to include his adoptive son in camping trips and other family activities, Ted remained distant. He later complained to his girlfriend that Johnny wasn't his real father. He wasn't very bright and didn't make much money. Bundy had different recollections of Tacoma when he spoke to his biographers. When he talked to McCord and Ainsworth, he described how he roamed his neighborhood, picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women. When he spoke to Polly Nelson, he explained how he perused detective magazines, crime novels, and true crime documentaries for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead or maimed bodies. In a letter to Rule, he asserted that he never ever read fact detective magazines and shuddered at the thought that anyone would in his conversation with McCord. He described how he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing or whatever else that could be seen. Bundy also varied the accounts of his social life. He told McCord and Ainsworth that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. He claimed that he had no natural sense of how to develop a friendship. "I didn't know what made people want to be friends," he said. "I didn't know what underlay social interactions." Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School told Rule, however, that Bundy was well known and well liked. "They're a medium-sized fish in a large pond." Bundy's only significant athletic avocation was downhill skiing, which he enthusiastically pursued, using stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. When he reached 18, the details of the incidents were expunged from his record, as is customary in Washington. After graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound, UPS, for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, he became romantically involved with a UW classmate who is identified by several pseudonyms in Bundy's biographies, most commonly Stephanie Brooks. In early 1968, he dropped out of college and worked at a series of minimum wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington state. In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami as a Rockefeller delegate. Shortly thereafter, Brooks ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California, frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as probably the pivotal time in his development. Devastated by Brooks's rejection, Bundy traveled to Colorado and then further east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia, and enrolling for one semester at Temple University. It was at this time in early 1969, Ann Rule believes, that Bundy visited the Office of Birth Records in Burlington and confirmed his true parentage. Bundy was back in Washington by the fall of 1969 when he met Elizabeth Clover, identified in Bundy literature as Meg Anders, Beth Archer, or Liz Kendall, a divorcee from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Their stormy relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. In the mid-1970s, Bundy, now focused and goal-orientated, re-enrolled in UW, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met and worked alongside Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer, an aspiring crime writer. She would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time and described him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. After graduating from UW in 1972, Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans' re-election campaign. Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans's opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and recorded his stump speeches for analysis by Evans's team. Evans appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. After Evans was re-elected, Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several UW psychology professors. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Brooks. She marveled at his transformation into a serious, dedicated professional. Seemingly on the cusp of a legal and political career, he continued to date Clover as well. Neither woman was aware of the other's existence. In the fall of 1973, Bundy matriculated at UPS Law School and continued courting Brooks, who flew to Seattle several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage. At one point, he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. In January 1974, however, he abruptly broke off all contact. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. Finally reaching him by phone a month later, Brooks demanded to know why Bundy had unilaterally ended their relationship without explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. He later explained, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." But Brooks concluded in retrospect that he had deliberately planned the entire courtship and rejection in advance, as vengeance for the breakup she initiated in 1968. By then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely, as young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. Ted Bundy's first two series of murders. Washington, Oregon. There is no consensus on when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. He told Nelson that he attempted his first kidnapping back in 1969 in Ocean City, New Jersey, but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women in Atlantic City in 1969 while visiting family in Philadelphia. He hinted but refused to elaborate to homicide detective Robert D. Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972 and another murder in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater. Rule and Keppel both believed that he might have started killing as a teenager. Circumstantial evidence supported that he may have abducted and killed 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr of Tacoma when he was 14 years old in 1961, an allegation that he reportedly denied. His earliest documented homicides were committed in 1974 when he was 27 years old. By then, by his own admission, he had mastered the necessary skills in the era before DNA profiling to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at crime scenes. Shortly after midnight on January 4th, 1974, around the time that he terminated his relationship with Brooks, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, identified as Joni Lenz, Mary Adams, and Terry Caldwell by various sources, a dancer and a student at UW. After bludgeoning Sparks senseless with a metal rod from her own bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with either the same rod or a metal speculum, causing extensive internal injuries. She remained unconscious for 10 days, but survived with permanent physical and mental disabilities. In the early morning hours of February 1st, Bundy broke into the basement room of Linda Ann Healy, a UW undergraduate who broadcast morning radio, weather sports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse and boots, and carried her away. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about one per month. On March 12, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus, but she never arrived. On April 17th, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles southeast of Seattle. Two female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters. One on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier, with a man wearing an arm sling asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. On May 6th, Roberta Kathleen Parks left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 85 miles south of Portland, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. Detectives from King County and Seattle Police Departments grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common, apart from being young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. On June 1st, Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. In the early hours of June 11th, UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding absolutely nothing. After Hawkins' disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man that night in an alley behind a nearby dormitory. He was on crutches with a leg cast and was struggling to carry a briefcase. One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy later told Keppel that he lured Hawkins to his car before rendering her unconscious with a crowbar. He then handcuffed Hawkins and drove her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles east of Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. Bundy said that Hawkins regained consciousness inside his car and said she had a Spanish test the following day, and she thought that I had taken her to help her tutor her for the Spanish test. It's not funny, he added, but it's odd the kinds of things people will say under those circumstances. He stated that he returned to UW Alley the morning after Hawkins' abduction and murder. There, in the very midst of a major crime scene investigation, he located and gathered Hawkins' earrings and one of her shoes, where he had left them in the adjoining parking lot, and departed unobserved. He admitted to revisiting Hawkins's corpse on 3 occasions. During this period, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where he wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Later he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, DES, a state government agency involved in the search for the missing women. At DES, he met and dated Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of 2, who 6 years later would play important roles in the final phase of his life. Reports of the 6 missing women and Sparks' brutal beating appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the paucity of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police could not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work, within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans, and most crime scenes there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or a sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Pacific Northwest murders culminated on July 14th with the broad daylight abductions of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. 5 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British, introducing himself as Ted. He asked for their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-coloured Volkswagen Beetle. 4 refused. 1 accompanying as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story, and watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Mary Nasland, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Bundy told both Stephen McCord and William Hagmeyer that Ott was still alive when he returned with Nasland, and that he forced one to watch as he murdered the other, but he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Elizabeth Clover, Anne Rule, a DES employee and a UW psychology professor, all recognized the profile, the sketch and the car, reported Bundy as a possible suspect, but detectives, who were receiving up to 200 tips per day, thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. On September 6th, 2 grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Ott and Nesland near a service road in Issaquah, 2 miles east of Lake Sammamish State Park. An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as those of Georgianne Hawkins. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked just east of Issaquah. Manson's remains were never recovered. Idaho, Utah and Colorado. In August 1974, Bundy received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Clover in Seattle. While he called Clover often, he dated at least a dozen other women. As he studied the first-year law curriculum a second time, he was devastated to find out that the other students had some intellectual capacity that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. It was a great disappointment to me, he said. A new string of homicides began the following month, including 2 that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution. On September 2nd, he raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then either disposed of the remains immediately in a nearby river or returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse. On October 2nd, he seized 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, some 200 miles south of Holiday, but they were never found. On October 18th, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, another Salt Lake City suburb, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. Her nude body was found in nearby mountainous area 9 days later. Post-mortem examination indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. On October 31st, Laura Ann Aim, also 17, disappeared 25 miles south in Lehi after leaving a cafe just after midnight. Her naked body was found by hitchhikers 9 miles to the northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. Both women had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and Aim, including hair shampooing and application of makeup. In the late afternoon of November 8th, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol DeRonge at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Melissa Smith was last seen. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told DeRonge that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When DeRonge pointed out to Bundy that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station. He immediately pulled into the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Derange was able to open the car door and escape. Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, 20 miles north of Murray, disappeared after leaving a theatre production at the school to pick up her brother. The school's drama teacher and a student told police that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him again shortly before the end of the play outside the auditorium. Investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Carol Derange's wrist. In November, Elizabeth Clover called King County's police a second time after reading that young women were disappearing in towns surrounding Salt Lake City. Detective Randy Hergschmeyer of the Major Crimes Division interviewed her in detail. By then, Bundy had risen considerably on the King County's hierarchy of suspicion, but the Lake Sammamish witnesses, considered most reliable by detectives, failed to identify him from a photo lineup. In December, Clover called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office and repeated her suspicions. Bundy's name was added to their list of suspects, but at that time no credible forensic evidence linked him to the Utah crimes. In January 1975, Bundy returned to Seattle after his final exams and spent a week with Clover, who did not tell him that she had reported him to the police on 3 occasions. She made plans to visit him in Salt Lake City in August. In 1975, Bundy shifted much of his criminal activity eastward, from his base in Utah to Colorado. On January 12th, a 23-year-old registered nurse named Karen Eileen Campbell disappeared while walking down a well-lit hallway between the elevator and her room at the Wildwood Inn, now the Wildwood Lodge, in Snowmass Village, 400 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Her new body was found a month later, next to a dirt road just outside the resort. She had been killed by blows to her head from a blunt instrument that left distinctive linear grooved depressions on her skull. Her body also bore deep cuts from a sharp weapon. On March 15th, 100 miles northeast of Snowmass, Vail ski instructor Julie Cunningham, 26, disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date with a friend. Bundy later told Colorado investigators that he approached Cunningham on crutches and asked her to help carry his ski boots to his car, where he clubbed and handcuffed her, then assaulted and strangled her at a secondary site near Rifle, 90 miles west of Vail. Weeks later, he made the 6-hour drive from Salt Lake City to revisit her remains. Denise Lynn Olivierson, 25, disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border in Grand Junction on April 6th while riding her bicycle to her parents' house. Her bike and sandals were found under a viaduct near Railroad Bridge on May 6th. Bundy lured 12-year-old Lynette Dawn Culver from Alameda Junior High School in Pocatello, Idaho, 160 miles north of Salt Lake City. He drowned and then sexually assaulted her in his hotel room before disposing of her body in a river north of Pocatello, possibly the Snake. In mid-May, 3 of Bundy's Washington State DES co-workers, including Carol Ann Boone, visited him in Salt Lake City and stayed for a week in his apartment. Bundy subsequently spent a week in Seattle with Clover in early June, and they discussed getting married the following Christmas. Again, Clover made no mention of her multiple discussions with the King County Police and Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. Bundy disclosed neither his ongoing relationship with Boone nor a concurrent romance with a Utah law student known in various accounts as Kim Andrews or Sharon Orr. On June 28th, Suzanne Curtis vanished from the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, 45 miles south of Salt Lake City. Curtis's murder became Bundy's last confession, tape recorded moments before he entered the execution chamber. The bodies of Wilcox, Kent, Cunningham, Olivierson, Culver and Curtis were never recovered. In August or September 1975, Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Although he was not an active participant in services and ignored most church restrictions, he would later be excommunicated by the LDS Church following his 1976 kidnapping conviction. When asked his religious beliefs after his arrest, Bundy answered Methodist, the religion of his childhood. In Washington state, investigators were still struggling to analyze the Pacific Northwest murder spree that had ended as abruptly as it began. In an effort to make sense of an overwhelming mass of data, they resorted to the then innovative strategy of compiling a database. They used the King County payroll computer, a huge primitive machine by contemporary standards, but the only one available for their use. After inputting the many lists they had compiled, classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders and so on, they queried the computer for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 lists. One was Ted Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Ted Bundy was on that list as well. He was literally at the top of the pile of suspects when word came from Utah of his arrest. And that's it for tonight. Stay tuned for a part 2 of his trials and arrests and even his escape. If you have any scary stories you want narrated on the channel, then submit them to reddit.com/r facebook.com/homeofscares and follow me on Twitter at homeofscares. Don't forget to click that subscribe button and that bell icon so you know every time I upload. Now, good night, my little hellhounds.